How do you tell your people to suffer just to keep another nation's empire from sinking? In Tokyo, boardrooms sit tense, pension funds battered, auto giants bleeding, and yet somewhere across the ocean, a man in Washington says, raise your rates, save our dollar. But this time, Japan said no. It began with silence. Years of nodding, years of buying bonds that were never theirs. They believed it was loyalty. They were told it was partnership. But what kind of partnership forces one to bleed so the other can breathe? Toyota just lost $1.3 billion. Mazda cannot even publish earnings. The yen is falling, the dollar is drowning, and between them lies a breaking point. This is not about inflation anymore. It is about sovereignty. Because what happens when the most loyal ally chooses survival over servitude? What happens when the pillar of Asia turns its back? Japan is no longer Boeing. And the world is watching. Subscribe, not just for this video, but for the dream of a fairer world. There was a time when holding the American dollar meant holding safety. Central banks treasured it like gold. Investors called it sacred. But sacred things need trust. And trust, once cracked, is hard to fix. In 2025, that crack became a chasm. The US dollar has lost 10 to 11% of its value just this year. For foreign investors, this was not a dip, it was betrayal. Imagine putting your faith in a friend, lending them your savings, only to watch them spend it recklessly, and then ask for more. That is what Washington has done to the world. The US government's borrowing has spiraled. Deficits are projected to grow by more than $3 trillion. Debt now stands at 122% of GDP. And yet, the demands keep coming. From Tokyo to Frankfurt, finance ministers whisper, is this still a safe bet? For Japan, the answer is increasingly no. Once the biggest foreign buyer of US debt, Tokyo, is now quietly pulling away. Japanese participation in the last treasury bond auction fell below 14%, a 6-month low. Why? Because even loyalty has a limit. And the numbers tell the story. Foreign central banks have reduced their holdings of US securities to the lowest since 2017. They are not waiting for America to collapse. They are preparing for when it does. This quiet exodus has a name: de-dollarization. It is not just China, it is not just Russia. It is allies, partners, friends. They are buying gold, investing in Eurobonds, exploring the Chinese yuan. A 2025 IMF report found that 85% of global reserve managers now list US sanctions risk as a reason to reduce dollar exposure. Let that sink in. Even friends fear being punished by the empire they helped build, and so they leave. Because no one wants to build their future on a crumbling floor. Japan is not sabotaging America. Japan is saving itself. And when your people are facing inflation, when your companies are losing billions, and when your future is tied to a foreign debt spiral, they will all say, you do not ask for permission to walk away. You walk. They said America was the safest hand, but even safe hands can drop what they cannot carry. They called it diplomacy, but it felt like blackmail. In secret meetings, U.S. officials demanded Japan raise interest rates, buy more treasury bonds, and let the yen bleed just to help the dollar breathe. But this time, Japan did something unthinkable. They threatened to strike back. Not with tanks, not with missiles, but with something far more powerful. A bond sale. In May 2025, Japan's finance minister Katsunobu dropped a bombshell. He announced that Japan's $1.1 trillion of U.S. Treasury holdings could become a bargaining chip. His words were cold, calculated. This is no longer a matter of trust. It is a matter of national survival. Make no mistake, that was not a threat. It was a line in the sand. And Tokyo had already begun preparing. Japan boosted exports to CPTP partners by 17% in Q1 of 2025, especially to the Middle East. They signed new trade deals with the UAE, redirected auto shipments to Canada and Mexico. They were building a world without Washington. Because when one partner starts acting like an overlord, the other finds new doors. Even Japanese officials who once played nice are sounding the alarm. Ryo Akazawa, chief negotiator, warned that if Trump's administration continues its pressure campaign, Japan will reevaluate the foundation of this alliance. Behind closed doors, the strategy is simple. Stay silent, act bold. And if Washington refuses to listen, sell. Dumping even a fraction of their treasury holdings could cause a spike in U.S. interest rates, a crash in the dollar, and a ripple through Wall Street that makes April's panic look like a rehearsal. This is not panic, this is leverage. And here is the uncomfortable truth. America gave them the leverage by becoming addicted to borrowing. So now we ask, if you were Japan, would you protect your people or protect America's debt? Would you raise interest rates to help Washington even if your own economy might collapse? Because that is the choice Tokyo faces, and that is the choice many countries may face next. Let us step inside Japan. Not the skyscrapers, not the neon lights, but the quiet homes, the trembling boardrooms, the bruised balance sheets, because while Washington pushes Japan is bleeding, in the first quarter of 2025, Japan's GDP shrank by 0.7%. Exports fell by 0.6%. Household spending, more than half of Japan's economy, flatlined. This is not just a slowdown. This is a stall. And now, America wants them to hit the brakes harder, raise interest rates, tighten policy. to fix a trade imbalance that Japan never created. Let us be clear. The Bank of Japan, the BOJ, is not a reckless actor. They held rates near zero for years through yield curve control just to keep the economy alive. But in 2024, they gave in to pressure. Rates climbed to 0.5% by January. By May, 30-year bond yields exploded to 3.15%, the highest since 1999. 40-year bonds soared to 3.635%. Markets panicked, economists warned, because for a country where the debt-to-GDP ratio is 236%, this was no small shift. Higher yields mean heavier losses. And with the BOJ holding 80% of Japanese government bonds, this is not just market pressure. This is existential risk. A single misstep could trigger a bond market implosion, destabilizing not just Japan, but global finance. Deutsche Bank estimates Japan would need a 20 to 25% yen appreciation to meet U.S. trade demands. That would wipe out exporters like Toyota already reeling from tariffs. It could send the entire economy into a tailspin. And still, America insists, as if Japan's pain is just a statistic. But inside the BOJ, they are not sleeping easy. Governor Kazuo Ueda warns, household consumption is too weak for aggressive hikes. Yes, inflation is above the 2% target, but it is driven by food and fuel, not robust demand. Raising rates now would not inspire spending, it would strangle it. A May 2025 Reuters poll showed 68% of Japanese economists urging the BOJ to hold off on tightening until U.S. trade policy stabilizes. Some officials are even considering delaying bond tapering beyond Q4 2025 to avoid chaos. And yet, across the ocean, Washington shouts louder. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, all pushing different messages, all demanding the impossible. The negotiations, they have stalled. Why? Because America cannot even agree with itself. They said it was about fairness. But fairness cannot ask one nation to slit its own throat. For decades, Japan stood in the shadow of a superpower. Faithful, predictable, quiet. But in 2025, that silence broke. Because behind the scenes, Tokyo has been building a different future, one that no longer orbits Washington. Instead of bending to U.S. demands, Japan is leaning hard into the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership (CPTP), a 12-country trade bloc they helped rescue after the U.S. abandoned the original TPP. And it is working. In just the first quarter of 2025, exports to CPTP nations surged. Shipments to the Middle East alone jumped 17%. New deals with the UAE are slashing dependence on American markets. Auto exports are now flowing fast to Mexico and Canada, bypassing the tariff traps set by Trump's White House. This is not retreat, this is redirection. It is Japan telling the world we are no longer your economic firewall. We are our own force. But it goes deeper, because Tokyo is holding a card that could upend the entire financial architecture of the West. Their $1.1 trillion stash of U.S. treasuries. Finance Minister Katsunobu once said they would never weaponize those bonds. But in May 2025, he changed his tune. They are now a bargaining chip. The message was unmistakable. If the U.S. keeps pressing, Japan might start selling. That is the nuclear option. Because even the rumor of a mass treasury sell-off sends markets into chaos. Remember the April 2025 scare. If Japan moves, that was just a tremor. The real quake would shake Wall Street, spike interest rates, and hammer the dollar's value. Later, Katsunobu softened the tone, saying no sale was imminent. But the signal had been sent, and Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba made it crystal clear, this is a fight for our national interest. He is under pressure. The July 20th, 2025 upper house election is coming, and voters want a leader who will not bow. They want justice. That is why Japan's negotiators like Ryo Akazawa are now offering agricultural and gas deals not just to appease the U.S., but to prove we can trade fairly, but we won't be bullied. But Trump's team is not budging. It is not diplomacy anymore. It is a full-on standoff. And Tokyo is preparing for a future where America is no longer the partner it once trusted. They are keeping rates low to ease the blow from a weakened yen. They are ready to intervene in the currency market like they did in 2022 and 2024. They are still investing in America, but no longer from loyalty, from strategy, to buy time, to survive. Because they know Trump's tariffs are burning the alliance that once kept the Pacific stable. And while Japan still respects the bond, it now respects itself more. This is not just Japan's story. It is a signal, a warning, a mirror. Because when the most loyal ally chooses defiance over dependence, something bigger is breaking. For too long, nations like Japan were told, help us carry our debt, help us save our empire. And they did. They bought the bonds, they adjusted their currencies, they took the hits, all in the name of partnership. But partnership without dignity is not alliance. It is quiet subjugation. And now that silence is over, Japan is not shouting, they are not marching. But they are moving, redirecting exports, signing new deals, holding back their buying power, and quietly placing the world's most powerful currency on notice. This is not economic rebellion. It is economic self-respect. Because if America can demand sacrifices from friends while printing trillions for itself, then maybe friendship needs new rules. Maybe power needs limits. Maybe debt should come with consequences. Prime Minister Oshiba is not waging war. He is answering a deeper call to protect his people, to put Japan first before politics, before pressure, before pretense, and that shift echoes beyond Tokyo. Other nations are watching, asking if Japan can say no, why can't we? Africa, Latin America, the global south, all those once told to obey, to adjust, to assist, they are awakening, because this is not about bonds. It is about bondage. And Japan just picked up the key. They were never just another partner, they were the pillar, and now that pillar is learning to stand alone. In this moment, Japan is not just protecting its economy, it is reclaiming its agency, and that is a lesson for every nation still kneeling before foreign debts and demands. Comment New Africa if you believe every nation has the right to say no. Share this video, not because it is trending, but because it tells the story of a global shift that is only just beginning. Subscribe, not for algorithms, but for the vision of a world where dignity matters more than debt. In the shifting winds of global power, Japan's quiet defiance in 2025 speaks volumes not only about its economic resilience, but about the deeper truths of alliance autonomy and dignity. For decades, Japan stood as the faithful ally to the United States. It bought American debt, adjusted its currency to American interests, and absorbed the impact of Washington's fiscal recklessness, all under the guise of friendship and strategic partnership. But as the U.S. economy teetered under the weight of its own debt, over 120% of its GDP, and the dollar's value slipped by over 10% in a single year, the very foundation of trust began to fracture. Japan, once silent and compliant, now faces a critical reckoning. Can a nation continue to sacrifice its own people for the sake of an alliance that offers no protection in return? The events unfolding in 2025 expose a stark imbalance in international relations. America's demand that Japan raise interest rates, increase bond purchases, and tolerate a weakening yen is not diplomacy. It is economic coercion. Behind the curtain of partnership lies the expectation that allies must carry the weight of a crumbling empire. And yet when Toyota reports over $1 billion in losses, when household consumption flatlines, and when the Bank of Japan faces financial implosion from rising yields, it becomes clear that loyalty has become a burden too heavy to bear. What is unfolding is not just a disagreement over monetary policy, it is the quiet rebellion of a nation reclaiming its voice. This is where the lesson deepens. Japan's response is not loud, it is deliberate. Through trade diversification, strategic partnerships with CPTP nations, and a measured shift away from U.S. treasuries, Japan is redefining what it means to be sovereign in a world dominated by debt diplomacy. By leveraging its massive U.S. bond holdings not as a weapon, but as a signal, Japan is saying our survival will not be traded for your convenience. It is a subtle but powerful message, one that challenges the post-war order without resorting to confrontation. And it resonates far beyond Tokyo. For many nations across the global south, those long entangled in asymmetric alliances, conditional aid, and structural economic dependency, Japan's actions serve as a blueprint. It shows that resistance does not always come through protest or provocation. Sometimes it comes through financial reorientation, quiet trade revolutions, and the courage to say no behind closed doors, the courage to stop accepting terms dictated by others, the courage to place national well-being above global obligation. This moment also unmasks the fragility of the U.S.-led financial system. The assumption that the dollar will always be trusted, that U.S. bonds will always be bought, that allies will always comply. These are myths now crumbling under the weight of rising deficits, inconsistent foreign policy, and the overuse of sanctions as a tool of diplomacy. Trust is the true currency of global finance, and when that trust is broken, even the most stable empires tremble. What Japan teaches us is that sovereignty is not declared. It is exercised. It is not about isolationism or rejection of global cooperation. It is about the right to choose, the right to dissent, the right to protect one's people without apology. And perhaps most importantly, it is about knowing when to walk away from a table where the terms are no longer fair. For nations like Burkina Faso, Ghana, Mozambique, or even post-Brexit Britain, the echoes of Japan's stand should provoke deeper reflection. What does partnership mean when it demands silence? What does alliance mean when it requires economic self-harm? In a world increasingly polarized, the old rules no longer apply. The most powerful nation in the world is now struggling to sell its debt, not because of a military threat, but because of dwindling credibility. And in that vacuum, nations are finding new strength, not in confrontation, but in recalibration. Japan's story is not unique, but its response is rare. It is a reminder that true strength lies not in loud declarations, but in quiet, resolute choices. That walking away is not a betrayal, it is sometimes the only path to self-preservation. And that dignity, once reclaimed, changes everything. For all who have felt coerced, indebted, or undervalued, Japan's awakening is your call too. What makes Japan's stand in 2025 so significant is not just the magnitude of the financial implications, but the moral clarity it represents. For far too long, the architecture of global finance has been built upon quiet compliance, especially from nations seen as junior partners. These partners were expected to absorb inflation, adjust policy, devalue currencies, and cushion the excesses of wealthier economies. But what happens when that deference is no longer sustainable? Japan is showing the answer it fractures, not with noise, but with dignity. When a nation with over 200% debt to GDP ratio is asked to raise rates, hurt its exports, and still prop up a collapsing foreign currency, it becomes more than an economic issue. It becomes a question of identity. It forces leaders to ask, who do we serve? Whose crisis are we solving? And what future are we denying ourselves in the process? The quiet defiance coming out of Tokyo is not just a strategic decision, it is a generational turning point, a cultural shift. For decades, Japan was taught that stability came from alignment, that prosperity came from obedience, that deviation from Washington's script risked isolation. But this moment in 2025 proves that isolation is no longer the cost of sovereignty. In fact, it may be the price of freedom, and freedom once tasted cannot be revoked. This is the deeper truth. Alliances rooted in fear cannot survive the light of economic reality. The United States, burdened by its own contradictions, is now asking its allies to behave like colonies, to sacrifice growth, damage their people's livelihoods, and absorb the fallout of policies they did not write. But Japan has quietly answered no more. This is why Tokyo's pivot matters. It is not a complete rejection of America. It is a reclaiming of space. It is the economic equivalent of standing up at a table and saying, I will not carry this weight alone. It is measured but unshakable. It is not nationalistic chest thumping. It is quiet strategic rebellion. Other countries should take note. In Africa, where countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal often adjust interest rates and economic policy based on IMF or World Bank expectations that echo Western priorities. Japan's example is revolutionary, not because it is radical, but because it is calm. Not because it breaks the system, but because it steps around it. And perhaps that is what makes it so powerful. In a world addicted to speed and spectacle, Japan's resistance is methodical. Patient, it builds over months through trade realignments, fiscal adjustments, and diplomatic recalibration. And in doing so, it reminds us that power does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers. The question now is who's listening? The dollar will not collapse overnight. The US remains a giant, but the foundation of trust on which all empires rest is quietly shaking. And when that trust slips, alternatives emerge. They may not be perfect, they may not be immediate, but they grow like cracks in a dam, invisible, then unstoppable. Japan's story is a mirror for every nation that has ever doubted its own agency. It reminds us that global respect is not earned by obedience. It is earned by resilience, by courage, and by the refusal to sacrifice your children's future for another nation's comfort. So let this moment linger. Let it speak beyond currency markets and bond yields. Let it sink into the conscience of leaders who still believe their only choice is submission, and let it echo through the corridors of international institutions where the terms of aid, trade, and diplomacy have long favored the powerful. Because Japan did not ask to lead a rebellion, but by saying no, they may have started one. What Japan faces today, Africa has faced for decades. The only difference is volume. The methods are the same: debt diplomacy, coercive trade terms, and a financial order where saying no comes at a cost. But slowly voices are rising, not in rage, but in realignment. The lesson from Japan is this: dignity is not won through confrontation, but through the slow, firm rejection of systems that ask you to kneel. Burkina Faso once exported gold worth billions, yet could not afford gloves in its public hospitals. Ghana sells cocoa beans the world craves, but still imports chocolate. These contradictions are not mistakes. They are the design of a world where power is enforced not with weapons, but with spreadsheets. Interest rates become shackles, loans become leashes, and like Japan, African nations are waking to this truth, not with protest, but with policy. Thomas Sankara once said, "He who feeds you controls you." He knew that sovereignty begins in the stomach, and what Japan is doing today is economic sovereignty in action. Quiet, deliberate, and deeply moral. They are not walking away from the world. They are walking towards a version of it that respects their right to choose. And this is where the Global South must find clarity. For too long, African economies have been built on a script not written by Africans, a script that says development must come with debt, that progress must come through dependency, and that stability is only achieved when someone else holds the pen. But what if that story is wrong? What if Japan is showing us a different kind of future? It begins with this: refuse the unacceptable. Do not raise rates to protect foreign currencies. Do not devalue your currency to please external creditors. Do not cut your people's food, fuel, or future so someone else's bond market can stay afloat. It is not about rejection, it is about realignment. Africa, like Japan, holds immense leverage. It is young, resource-rich, and geostrategically vital. Yet its leadership has often been conditioned to believe that power lies elsewhere, But perhaps the most powerful act is not defiance. It is departure. Walking away from unfair deals. Saying no when the terms do not serve the people. This is the deeper revolution. A farmer in Mali who plants local seed instead of imported GMO is part of it. A finance minister in Namibia who chooses regional trade over IMF prescriptions is part of it. A mother in Sierra Leone who questions why her child dies next to a gold mine is part of it. Japan's current defiance is not just geopolitical news. It is a blueprint. It says, protect your economy without apology. Rebalance your alliances without shame. And most importantly, trust your people before you trust foreign credit ratings. Because at the end of the day, no bond market is more sacred than a child's future. No currency is more valuable than a nation's self-worth. No deficit is greater than a society that forgets its own right to stand tall. And as Japan edges closer to economic sovereignty, perhaps Africa and all formerly silenced nations can see not a rival, but a reflection. A reminder that dignity is not granted, it is asserted. And once asserted, it echoes across oceans. The story of 2025 is not about bonds, it is about bondage. And it is about time. We chose freedom. In the end, what Japan teaches us is not about yen or the tariffs, not even about the dollar. It is about a deeper kind of accounting the moral balance sheet of a world long tilted by power and convenience. A world where the global North prints debt while the global South is told to tighten, where America can borrow at will but Africa must beg for grants, where Japan is pushed to sacrifice its people's well-being, all for the illusion of economic stability in Washington. That illusion is cracking. And cracks once exposed do not shrink. They spread. From Tokyo to Accra, from Port-au-Prince to Nairobi, they reveal a system where support is conditional, where aid is silent control, and where partnership means punishment for disobedience. What Japan is doing slowly, quietly, strategically is stepping off that stage. They are rewriting the role assigned to them after World War II. No longer the obedient investor, no longer the buyer of American debt at any cost. They are becoming something else, an economy that dares to think for itself. And in that defiance, there is a message for every nation still entangled in invisible chains. You are allowed to stop, you are allowed to question, you are allowed to walk away. The fear that we will collapse without them is manufactured. It is taught, but it is not true because collapse does not come from disobedience. It comes from silence, from swallowing the unacceptable, from pretending we are free when our budgets are written in someone else's language. This is the era of polite insubordination, where defiance is done through diversification, where resistance is measured in the refusal to comply, where independence is not a speech, it is a spreadsheet. Japan is not burning flags, they are shifting trades, they are not cutting ties, they are cutting dependence. And for Africa, this is not just inspiration, it is instruction. For too long, we were told we needed aid, but aid came with austerity. We were told to privatize water, sell off hospitals, and trust foreign experts. But what have we gained from that? We export cocoa and import chocolate, we sell gold and borrow dollars, we produce diamonds but build no refineries. This is not poverty, this is structural powerlessness. And the first step to undoing it is the same step Japan just took. Say no calmly, firmly, unapologetically. Say no to bond terms that favor creditors. Say no to interest rate hikes dictated from abroad. Say no to debt service that steals from health and education. Because the real debt is not financial, it is historical, it is moral. And the repayment begins with dignity. When Prime Minister Oshiba stood before his parliament in May 2025 and said, "This is a fight for our national interest," he was not being aggressive, he was being honest. And honesty in a world of economic doublespeak is revolutionary. Imagine if more leaders did that. Imagine if Burkina Faso, instead of pleading for debt relief, said, "We will invest in our farmers first." If Kenya said our interest rate is not a foreign decision. If Barbados said our tourism is not your playground, it is our economy. This is not anti-Western. This is pro-dignity. It is not isolationist. It is intentional, because global cooperation should be built on respect, not hierarchy, on mutual benefit, not quiet extortion. The future we want does not come from dependency dressed as diplomacy. It comes from economies like Japan saying, "We are done paying for your mistakes." And if Japan can do it with all its exposure to U.S. bonds, its aging population, its post-war deference, then so can nations who have been told to stay small, stay grateful, stay silent. That silence is ending. So here's the lesson. Do not wait for collapse to become free. Do not wait for permission to protect your people. Do not wait for history to redeem your choices. Be like Japan in 2025. History has always been shaped by the bold, but it is sustained by the quietly courageous. Japan's 2025 economic resistance is not a grand rebellion shouted from podiums. It is a slow withdrawal from a contract that no longer protects its interests. It is the art of stepping away without slamming the door. And in that departure lies a template one that every nation caught between obligation and self-preservation should study. Because if Japan, a nation historically known for discipline, loyalty, and restraint, can reach a point where it says enough, then surely others can too. For years, Japan bought American bonds not because it made sense, but because it was expected. It was unspoken, buy to be loyal, suffer to be relevant, but expectations are not binding, and now that expectation is breaking. And here is the truth. No one in Washington dares to say out loud, America depends more on its allies than its allies depend on America. The dollar's dominance exists not because of its strength, but because of others' compliance. Once that compliance fades, the illusion cracks. That illusion that the United States can spend without limit, sanction without consequence, and still be trusted as the world's safe haven is dissolving. Not because of war, but because of logic, because nations are no longer willing to pay the price of another country's excess. And the price has become unbearable. Higher rates mean domestic debt collapse. Currency manipulation means destroyed export markets. Blind loyalty means political suicide at home. For leaders like Oshiba who face elections and a growingly skeptical public continuing to play America's game is not just difficult, it is untenable. And for other world leaders watching this unfold, the message is clear. You are not disloyal if you choose survival. You are not radical if you say not today. You are not weak for wanting control over your own economy. This is what Africa must absorb. That real independence is not declared by flag ceremonies or anthems, it is proven in balance sheets. It is the ability to say, we will not adjust our currency for your comfort, to say we will not delay our hospitals to repay your interest, to say we will not shrink our dreams to fit your fiscal models. We were told for generations that we must grow slowly, borrow wisely, obey constantly. But who defined wise? Who measured growth? Who benefited from obedience? Japan's story is not just an economic warning, it is a spiritual awakening. A nation that once accepted its post-war role with humility has now outgrown that costume. They are stepping into their own design, and we must do the same. Because our ancestors did not survive slavery, colonization, and economic sabotage for us to spend our lives managing someone else's deficit. We were born to build our own. The soil beneath our feet is rich. Our youth are many. Our talents are abundant. What we lack is not wealth, but permission, and Japan reminds us you do not need permission to stop being exploited. You just need resolve. And this is not about hating the West. It is about loving ourselves more. It is about refusing to be a donor's success story or a development case study or a passive emerging market. It is about emerging fully, without apology, without delay. Because freedom delayed is opportunity denied. And if Japan with its vast holdings in American debt can risk turbulence for dignity, what excuse do we have? What are we waiting for? When will we choose budgets over bonds, people over prestige, sovereignty over silence? Perhaps the better question is not when, but why not now? WW Japan did not shout. They whispered, we're done, and the world heard them. Now it is your turn. If you lead a country, an organization, a family, ask yourself, what have I silently accepted that no longer serves me? Whose comfort have I preserved at the cost of my own? Whose voice do I need to reclaim? Because the new world is not being born through revolutions, it is being written quietly by nations that are finally choosing themselves, one trade at a time, one refusal at a time, one awakening at a time. And this too is how history is made. Say no when the cost of yes is your future. The story of America's corn collapse was never about a single season, a single price point, or even a single crop. It was about what happens when a nation stops listening, not just to markets, but to its own people. When it chooses tactics over transformation, when it wages a trade war but forgets to look inward at the systems that can no longer carry its weight. What rotted in those fields across Iowa and Indiana wasn't just corn. It was confidence, it was continuity, it was credibility. The world changed and America for too long refused to bend. Now as the dust settles, we are left with hard truths and harder decisions. Do we double down on a path already proven fragile? Or do we start again, not from pride, but from principle? It is not too late to choose resilience, but resilience today doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from connection, from transparency, from trust earned, not demanded. Because in this century, the nations that thrive will not be those who claim control. They will be the ones who show the world what responsibility looks like. This is not just a matter of policy, it is a matter of who we become. And that choice, like every good harvest, begins with what we decide to plant next. What began as an agricultural disruption ended as something far more profound. By the close of 2025, the collapse of U.S. corn exports had peeled back layers of assumption about markets, about power, and about who pays the price when national strategy loses sight of global change. The trade war, long framed as a tactical maneuver for economic justice, instead became a test of America's adaptability. And in that test, the country faltered. Across rural towns, the losses were not just measured in dollars or bushels, but in broken continuity, family farms left without successors, community institutions stretched, thin identities fractured. It became clear that resilience does not come from tariffs. It comes from readiness, from foresight, from listening not only to markets but to people. Internationally, the fallout struck at the core of U.S. credibility. For a nation that once dictated the terms of agricultural trade, the inability to meet evolving global standards exposed more than a lag in infrastructure. It revealed a reluctance to grow alongside the world. While competitors focused on traceability, sustainability, and climate alignment, the U.S. clung to outdated structures, betting that its scale alone would be enough. It wasn't. And yet within this unraveling lies an opportunity. Because no collapse is complete unless it is ignored. The failures of 2025 do not have to define the future, they can inform it. They can provoke reform not just in logistics or export policies, but in the deeper values that guide national economic direction. To move forward, America must ask harder questions, not how do we win the next trade dispute, but how do we rebuild systems that earn trust again? Trust not just from foreign buyers, but from the farmers at home who feel abandoned, from young people deciding whether rural life is worth preserving, from global partners seeking cooperation over conflict. The lesson of the trade war was never really about corn. It was about the cost of refusing to change and the clarity that comes when that cost becomes impossible to ignore. In that clarity lies a crossroads. One path leads back to old promises already broken. The other leads towards something harder but more honest, a reckoning with the world as it is, and the courage to meet it as a partner, not a fortress. Because in the end, no field grows in isolation, and no nation thrives by standing still. For decades, the world looked to the United States as the unquestioned leader in agricultural exports. American grain filled global silos. Its standards set the pace for trade. Its surplus fed entire nations. But in the aftermath of the 2025 crisis, triggered in part by a prolonged trade war, that dominance began to wane, not with a fight, but with a quiet withdrawal. At the heart of international trade is not just volume, it is trust. And trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. The global market watched as American corn shipments were rejected in New Orleans. Vessels sat idle, contracts were canceled. Buyers from Asia and Europe turned elsewhere, not because U.S. grain was too expensive, but because it was unpredictable. Too many regulatory delays, too many chemical compliance failures, too many shifting inspection rules worsened by policy rooted more in politics than in cooperation. Canada, by contrast, offered stability. Its blockchain-tracked grain low-emission production and consistent trade relationships made it a preferred partner. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and the Netherlands didn't just sign temporary contracts, they formed long-term supply agreements backed by systems of assurance. This was not just a logistical realignment, it was a geopolitical signal. Where once the U.S. led through scale, now it struggled to meet the basic entry criteria of a shifting market. Nations that once depended on American surplus began diversifying not just for price, but for predictability. In trade negotiations, credibility became more valuable than history, and increasingly the U.S. had less of it. Even allies began hedging. Mexico's ban on genetically modified corn in early 2025, long expected but never taken seriously by Washington, sent ripples through the industry. Instead of negotiating terms, U.S. leadership responded with pressure and threats, doubling down on a trade war approach that had already failed. The result, Mexican buyers shifted to South American suppliers, and the U.S. lost a key customer it once took for granted. In multilateral forums, the narrative shifted as well. The U.S. was no longer seen as a partner building global food security. It was viewed as a disruptor unwilling to meet the world halfway. The erosion of influence wasn't explosive. It was incremental, but undeniable. For a country that once prided itself on feeding the world, this reversal cut deep. Not just in GDP, but in identity. The trade war had been sold as a way to reclaim control, instead it signaled retreat. And in the vacuum, others rose not through confrontation, but through quiet consistency. Beneath the economic statistics, a quieter crisis was unfolding, one that no spreadsheet could quantify. It was a crisis of continuity, of generational bonds that had held for decades now breaking under the strain of uncertainty. The trade war didn't just disrupt the market, it disrupted the inheritance of a way of life. For many families in the American Midwest, farming wasn't just a livelihood, it was identity. Fathers passed down land to sons. Daughters returned from university to help with the books, the marketing, the harvests. Grandparents still walked the edges of their fields at sunrise, not out of necessity, but out of habit, pride, and memory. But in 2025, that cycle began to fracture. With corn prices crashing below break-even levels and global buyers abandoning U.S. grain, younger generations began to see farming not as opportunity, but as burden. What was once a legacy felt more like a liability. The promise of hard work leading to prosperity was gone. In its place, debt, stress, and stagnation. Many young farmers faced with mounting input costs and little chance of return walked away. Some found jobs in logistics hubs near cities. Others left agriculture entirely, taking with them skills, vision, and the potential for renewal. The loss wasn't just personal, it was structural. When a 26-year-old farmer leaves a family operation, that farm may limp on. But when 3 in a county do, the local machinery dealer shutters. The co-op consolidates, the school loses enrollment. The bank hesitates to extend credit. And so the collapse compounds. Older farmers, too proud to quit, stayed on, but at a cost. Many deferred maintenance, skipped health checks, or tapped retirement savings just to get through the season. These weren't bad decisions, They were desperate ones born from the belief that someone had to hold the line until better times returned. But what if they don't? That's the question. Now echoing across barns, silos, and dinner tables from Kansas to Ohio, not just, can we make it through this year, but will anyone want to take over when I'm gone? The trade war was supposed to protect American agriculture. Instead, it hastened a generational disconnect by pushing the young out, exhausting the old, and leaving a hollowed-out middle with no clear succession. This isn't only about economics, it's about dignity, about purpose, about the invisible threads that tie identity to land. And once those threads snap, they rarely return. At first glance, the collapse of U.S. corn exports might seem like a market correction, a painful but temporary setback in a volatile global system. But what unfolded across the Midwest in 2025 was far more than economic turbulence. It was the slow unraveling of community structures built on the assumption that America's agricultural dominance was immovable. The trade war, which had already exposed vulnerabilities in shipping inspection and compliance, began to reveal its human cost. In counties from Iowa to Illinois, families who had farmed for generations faced choices they were never prepared for: harvest at a loss, abandon their crops, or exit the industry entirely. But the damage did not stop at the edge of their fields. When corn lost its market, everything